so movies for me, like as a child, I wasn't much of a reader. I'm almost embarrassed to admit. Growing up in the 80s, just outside of Boston, my town was like one of the first towns that got cable television. So my exposure to story was almost all movies. And because cable TV or pay TV was so early in those days, I would see the same movies over and over. So I think as a child, I just sort of absorbed some of like how, movies and those stories were sort of structured. And I didn't come to reading until my early 20s. So I was a mathematics major, which is a long, boring story. But when I finally came to reading, that was like the new discovery to me. It was like, oh, and how did this, and I enjoyed seeing like how, books in cinema both approach things in the same way, but also sort of approach things in different ways. So I think that sort of comes out of my writing. I hear frequently, oh, your writing's very cinematic. And I'm like, oh, I don't know what that means. It's just how I tell story. With A Head Full of Ghosts in particular, once I had the idea for the story, I wanted to have an ambiguous possession story. I knew I couldn't avoid William Peter Blatty and William Friedkin's The Exorcist. So once I knew I had to, once I knew I was going to purposefully reference that movie, that sort of opened it up to every reference I could think of. And the purpose of that for the book was, I thought that was a great way to sort of heighten the ambiguity, to have the reader going through A Head Full of Ghosts and going, oh, wait a minute, that was like The Exorcist, or that was like Paranormal Activity. And my hope was that it would make the reader continually question what was going on. Because when that happens, I mean, to me, like even like in real life, like you were always comparing stuff to movies. Like when the pandemic happened, people were in the United States were watching the movie Contagion. I couldn't watch that, but I don't know. So I think especially now in our cultures now, or the popular cultures now, it's hard not to compare it to movies. So as a horror writer, for me, it's like fun just to have that sort of groundwater underneath, because it makes everything feel unsure. It was very strange, but like wonderfully strange, and sometimes like very stressful. Like the stressful parts were like the Hollywood business side of things, which wasn't fun to be honest. But like the movie itself and seeing that and experiencing that it's really hard to explain. When I first saw the movie, I saw it at the premiere in New York City, and there were certain points in the movie I just wanted to get up and sprint out of the theater because I was just so overwhelmed. And by the end of it, I was sweating like I just ran a marathon. But it was it was wonderful. It was amazing. To me, the book and the movie are adjacent, but really quite different. The changes are really only in the third act of the book and the movie. But to me, it sort of changes sort of like the whole idea of the story. But now, as someone who obviously, when you mentioned A Head Full of Ghosts, I love riffing on other ideas, other movies, other books. So it'd be really hypocritical of me to be like, oh no, the movie had to be this way. So just when I can be objective, it was really neat to see how someone else took that story and refracted it. As far as like writing for the movie, I had no say in what happened in the movie, which in some ways is good, because then I can be like, oh, it's not my fault. This is what they did. I love that phrase, "kill the fantastic." I'm gonna have to use that at some point. Especially at the novel length. Honestly, part of it is I have a hard time. Let me start over by saying, by day, like I teach mathematics, and that's sort of like a very rational. So I have the very rational side of my brain, and then I have the part of my brain that's afraid of the dark, will have demon dreams at night. And in the moment I'll be like, oh my God, that was, so terrifying. And the next day I'm always like, Paul, you're being so silly. There's no such thing as ghosts. There's no such thing as demons. So I think a lot of my novels sort of are me wrestling with my own beliefs in some way. But at the same time, I find anytime I feel like I'm referencing an ambiguity, I think that subconsciously picks at the ultimate ambiguity that awaits us all. Like what happens when we die? Like we don't know. We think we know, we have beliefs, but ultimately we don't know. And I think anytime ambiguity, particularly in Western culture, is referenced, I think it gets at that question. It can make us feel really uncomfortable. So as a horror writer, that's sort of what I'm always going for. I don't know if I can always scare people, because the scare is so subjective, but I feel like I have more control in making people feel uncomfortable and have it hopefully feel like their everyday lives. Like, I do want to write horror stories that feel like they could happen, even if there is a maybe sort of supernatural element. I've been very fortunate. I've been able to meet many, if not most, horror writers that people know, and I feel like so lucky that I was able to become friends with Peter. And even when I was friends with him, I would still get like a secret thrill Like when I saw him, a voice in my head would be like, "Holy crap, that's Peter Straub." I don't know. So for me, it's like for so many, it started with Stephen King, but through Stephen King, I found Clive Barker, Shirley Jackson, Peter Straub. And those writers were definitely very formative to me. But also so many of the people writing now, including Stephen Graham Jones is here. So many of my contemporaries. Whenever I read them, I get really excited, but also like, oh, I have to do better. I would include John Langan and Nadia Bulkin and Sarah Langan and other writers like that. So I don't know, like part of it is I was never trained in writing. Like I said, I studied mathematics in school. So I feel like I've learned by reading other people. And I feel like as the writer, I'm a magpie. I'm always trying to take little pieces and little bits and to try to build my own nest. So I have to be reading and admiring other writers, otherwise my writing's going to be terrible. Well, Sarah Langan has a book called A Better World. It hasn't been published yet in the US, but I will say that there are two books that I read in 2023 that are two of my favorites of all time, and one is Mariana Enriquez's Our Share of Night. It's genius. I've already read it twice, and it's a pretty long book. But also, I'm gonna butcher the guy's name, The Maniac by Benjamin Labadet. Like he's Chilean. Even though it's not published as a horror novel, and it's what they call a nonfiction novel, he's writing about a mathematician from Hungary who was at every sort of technological leap of the first half of the 20th century. And to me, it's one of the most terrifying cosmic horror novels I've ever read. So those two.